So I'm going to start with this image of myself in the Arctic Circle, just kind of parallel with Greenland and Svalbard. And as mentioned, I went there as part of a residency, but just to give you some kind of background context about myself, I am very much a misanthrope. I definitely think we're all going to be dead soon as a species. And I'm from the Midwest and very cut and dry to the core from the Midwest. And I'm from an industrial town where they produce the military tanks and also started one of the biggest kind of railroad intersections in the country in Ohio. And so it's also a farm community. So everything is really ruled by systematic things. So systematics in terms of production of things like car engines, railroads, farms. And I really got interested in the type of work that I'm going to show you and thinking about farming and where I'm from and thinking particularly about pests. So I think of us as kind of the biggest and largest expansive pest on the planet. Like I said, I think that we will extinct ourselves or the planet will kick us off soon. And I use pests in my work as a metaphor for our own kind of human existence and for looking at different systematic ways that we design things as humans and how insects design things. When I was asked to do this panel, I thought it was kind of funny that I was asked to be part of a robotics panel. Oops, I need to go backwards. Because I don't necessarily think of my work as robotic per se, though I do teach kinetics and electronics. But I got to thinking about my use of machines in my own work. And I do use digital fabrication almost entirely now to create most of my pieces. So collaborating really with machines all day long. So I'm going to walk through just a couple projects. I'm going to try and keep this in a 15-minute or less thing. So if you have questions, you can ask me afterwards. They're not in a particular order, but they are in terms of an order of thought. And so Primitive Borders was a piece that I made in 2017 as invitation for Transmediale in Berlin. And I started thinking about ant farms. I'm really interested in toys and science-based toys. I collected ants and I collected all sorts of insects as a child and hid them in my closet, which my mom was not thrilled to find later. And I had an ant farm as a kid, and I think about their systematic structures of the way that ants kind of operate. They have a queen, they have workers, they have soldiers. They have a real order to the way that they design their own habitats and the way that they live. And so as part of Transmediale, I had designed a system that was a speculative installation with ants acting as a metaphor for human societies, inspired by the Uncle Milton ant farm that's existed for 60 years, but now has been transformed to use this new kind of gel. They can freely travel from what I thought of as a primitive cluster to another. So a primitive in 3D modeling is a basic building block shape. We have a cube, a cone, a torus, and so on and so forth. And so each one of these levels was a different type of what I thought of as a continent that allowed the ants to kind of freely travel. There was a tube-based system from one continent to another. And I was really interested to see whether or not they would start collectively building with one another, whether they would wage war with one another, what kind of borders they would kind of self-impose. It was a really interesting project in that the type of ants that I was able to get in Germany, they could produce acid to eat through plastic. So they actually ate their way out of the piece, which was actually not thrilling for the gallery, but really thrilling for me. And so I thought of this as kind of like the ultimate act of breaking this border. This was also during the time that the government had issued particular travel bans, which was actually really problematic for a collaborator, Mortian Alahari, that I worked in this exhibition with. And so I'm including just a few images of, again, thinking through this idea of robotics. I wasn't really thinking about this piece in relationship to that, but the way I produce all of this work is I spend an immense amount of time producing files on my computer. So these are all of what I designed as these kind of clusters or various ant farms that I then CNC machine out as a retractive process and then use a vacuum former to ultimately make the containers. So I'm showing you maybe a little bit more of the process than I normally would. And so I fabricate my installations all the way using computational tools and machines, all the way from containment down to attachments. I try and use as little things that aren't made by myself as possible. So I'm going to switch gears. So this is Svalbard, where I mentioned that I was in 2014 as part of the Arctic Circle residency, where we sailed around this island for 3 weeks on a barkentine sailing ship. I'm just going to show some kind of images for scale. This landscape was really, really transformative in terms of my practice. And I really started thinking about myself as this kind of insect pest that exists on the planet, especially existing in a landscape like this and existing in a place that you really easily could die. We had polar bear guards at all times that kept us in a certain perimeter. And it was just a really, really harsh and interesting environment. And at the same time, I got to see firsthand how climate change really is impacting the globe at this kind of particular location. We watched glaciers break almost on the hour every day. The temperatures were often so warm we could wear t-shirts depending on the day, which was really kind of alarming. And again, I'm just going to kind of go through a couple images to give an idea of this kind of expanse landscape. And so while I was there, I had made plans to make this really large installation that had to do with wave data. And I really quickly realized that all of the instruments that I had brought were not going to work in this landscape. Batteries freeze. There is no internet. You don't talk to anyone in the outside world besides your shipmates for the entire duration that you're on the ship. And so all I was really left with was my equipment and ultimately my cell phone that didn't do anything except take pictures. So I started using my cell phone as a tool, and I'm really interested in thinking about these things that we carry around in our pockets as a tool for methods of making. And I started taking images to create photogrammetry scans of sea ice that had broken in the Arctic. And so I started going around and taking images of pieces of ice that I knew within about the hour or 2 hour mark wouldn't exist anymore because they'd broken off and were in kind of this warm area. I then used a software when I got back to reconstruct these images and objects into 3D models that I then took to a laser cutter and recreated in full scale as relics. I like to think of them as relics or almost like fossils of this landscape. To do this, the data went through around 9 translations from image to 3D model and then kind of back out. They're made out of plastic, which is a material that we obviously talk about in relation to climate change all of the time. And for me, making these out of that particular material, I think this is one of the materials that's still going to be here when maybe there's another civilization long into the future that discovers things that we've made. And this might be one of those kind of materials that represents who we are as a species, unfortunately. But for me, these represent a type of data loss, both in a landscape, but also in the reconstruction of these not existing again back as a full ice form, as having these kind of bits and pieces missing and really existing as kind of a skeletal representation of our landscape now. And so I'm constantly thinking about how we are shifting our landscape through the way that we organize ourselves as humans, the way we build things, the type of materials that we use. And so this was kind of a nod to that and thinking about how these might be the only instances of being able to have a tangible kind of relic of that landscape in the future. While I was also there, I had collected a series of rocks. You start to go a little crazy when it's 24 hours of daylight. And so I started collecting various rocks, and there's a pretty strict rule of like, you can't take anything from this landscape, nor should you. Though all 25 people that I was on the ship definitely did. And I think I started again, rather than taking these things with me, started 3D scanning them with my cell phone and then kind of leaving them behind. But what I realized was that the machine, these are 3D printed, ultimately couldn't replicate these in the way that were interesting to me in terms of like rock collecting or marking a particular space in time. They became weightless. The machine wasn't able to kind of replicate anything about these rocks, the color, the texture, the material, especially the weight that was really interesting to me. And so I started looking at these things mathematically as 3D meshes, as many people in here are aware of what this kind of image is, and thinking about, this is all this kind of amounts to the computer, while I had this very personal relationship with this material and this particular place. I did take one rock, which I shouldn't have, and I went to Catholic schools. I feel very guilty for taking this single rock. I felt guilty this entire time, and so much so that I decided to 3D scan this rock, which actually happens to be a fossil. I think it's a fossil of a whale tooth from talking with some geologists. And to kind of, I guess, deal with my own guilt for taking this really small object, I made this piece called Fossilized Guilt, which is a stolen fossil, a rubber cast of my right hand, and a custom magnification lens. And I used a CNC machine to ultimately reproduce this rock at the amount of weight that I felt like I was kind of carrying for keeping it. And so this is a really large, this is it coming off the CNC. I do not show this image very often. And this is it in its final form. And so I'm really interested in looking at our landscape and thinking about the ways we shift things like dirt and earth as humans, and the way that insects kind of do the same. And I'll kind of wrap up with that at the end. Wrong direction, let's see. And I'm really jumping around, and I hope it makes sense at the end. In 2012, I made a piece. I had been working with insects for a long time. The Arctic Circle was a real break in not working with other living species as part of my work. It was the first time that I kind of left that part of my work behind. But before the Arctic Circle, I almost exclusively worked with other living insects or other living animals, mostly insects and dogs. And in 2012, I made a piece called Tweet Roach, at Tweet Roach. It's on Twitter. And this was during an election cycle that we had. And it's essentially a robotic backpack that I had purchased from a group called Backyard Brains, which at the time were 2 PhD students from the University of Michigan who had developed this backpack to let you have your own cyborg at home. The idea was that it would help students, K through 12, learn different things about neuroscience and understand it through this cockroach. They had also made another device that let you take a cockroach's leg and cut it off and then listen to neurons within its leg. And I became really interested in their idea and their notion of commodifying this kind of cyborg idea, that if you had, a little bit of time, patience for touching an insect that most of us want to get rid of in our homes, and a little bit of, the access to the internet, that you were able to make your own at-home cyborg. So I essentially bought their design. I bought their backpack. This is made with those hex bugs from Target. You might know them. Your kids might have them. You might have one. It's basically a hacked circuit board from the hex bug toy. And then I made it so that it responded to Twitter. And this was during 2012 when we had an election. And so essentially Twitter drove this cockroach in space. So when people would hashtag right or left in relationship to politics, it would give the cockroach an electrical pulse, which would simulate it touching something or bumping into something and drive its physical body right or left. It got so overwhelming for the insect that I actually slowed down how quickly it would parse the tweets. But what was really interesting about this is that the cockroach learned to ignore the false signals. So somehow these creatures are able to ignore the internet, yet we can't put down our phones. And so this project was really controversial. This was the first time I had really used an insect or another living creature in a way that felt problematic to me. I purchase I don't actually go out into nature and remove insects. I'm really interested in this thing that we can use the internet to purchase insects. You can purchase ladybugs, termites, flesh-eating beetles, cockroaches. You can have them delivered right to your doorstep. And it was interesting, this project got quite a bit of backlash. It went on NBC News. I got emails from PETA. A lot of kind of anger over this small creature that we ultimately think of as a pest and that we societally spend millions of dollars eradicating from different structures and landscapes. And same with a lot of the other pests that I use in my work. I work with termites a lot. I love termites. I find them fascinating. This is a piece that I did with termites in Dallas that I had been invited to be part of this like huge projection festival in downtown. This is a very quick drawing of the DFW, what they call the Metroplex, which is the highway system. I used a Bic pen and termites will follow the smell of a Bic pen because it simulates a following pheromone. Mm-hmm. For me, insects, especially social insects like termites and ants, really do kind of replicate, or maybe we replicate their kind of structures. And I was interested in this being a tongue-in-cheek gesture of them driving down the highway, and there being accidents and people going off the road, congestion, and those types of things that we all think about as being very human problems, and kind of inserting an insect into this. I make my own microscopes a lot for my cell phone and for other cameras, and so this was another kind of exercise in making my own microscope. They follow it pretty much to a certain degree with a few kind of people going off the road, insects. I've been interested in termites for the last decade. I had made a piece called Partnered, We Are All Pests, which was a sonic floor installation that ultimately explores the notion of the term pest, and this is where I really kind of started getting into this work, and started thinking about termites as a possible partner in energy production. So when termites eat anything that's cellulose-based, they produce hydrogen and methane gases, among other things. And so this piece was one of a multitude of exercises, I'm only going to show this one, where I was measuring gas that was produced by termites. In this particular installation, I had installed the termites under the floor, and they had a tubed system where they could travel from one container to the other. And I was using my own paper waste to make things that they would consume. And so I have this kind of fantasy that I can take all of the junk mail that I get. I used everything from my birth certificate to junk mail to car registrations in this piece that I cut up and then reconfigured for them to eat. And they could travel from one to the other, basically sampling different materials to see which ones they like the most. And while people were on this platform, the sound of them eating in real time was transduced through the wood. So it was basically a big sound transducer, and you could lay on top of it. You had to crawl or kind of move more like an insect to interact with this piece. And it became this thing where people would like eat lunch on it and like lay on it and have this kind of like body to body experience with the termites. Mm-hmm. And these are just some examples of paper, pizza boxes. Bills were my favorite to feed them. Around the same time, I was invited at the Hyde Park Art Center to do a piece on their projection gallery. And I decided to think about, at the time, this was a really quickly gentrifying neighborhood in Hyde Park, especially across the street. And so I started thinking again about pests and about this idea of gentrification and constant buildup and tearing the landscape up to add, these kind of really clean and sleek apartment buildings, which I think of as like a hive. And so I'd made a piece called Host, where I had inserted bean beetles, which are a type of beetle that are common in the Midwest, and soybean fields that are a pest that farmers spend a lot of money to get rid of. And I started using them as a system that was supposed to be a mirror of the apartment construction. So the way that these insects essentially operate is that they will lay an egg on a bean and then the beetle eats its way out. And they keep doing that over and over and over in a cyclical manner until there's nothing left of the bean. And again, that's kind of how I think that we as people operate on this earth. We're going to keep doing things until there's nothing left for us to kind of have or survive on. There's videos of all of this, by the way. I didn't want to take up too much time today on my website. I like to make backpacks for things. I started by making these really small backpacks for what are called best beetles, which again are a common beetle that you can find in the Midwest. It's just a battery, an LED, and Velcro. And these beetles are used in science classes, K through 12, and they do an experiment called the penny pole, where you tie a petri dish to this beetle's waist and you see whose is the strongest. And it's an experiment about exoskeletons and understanding how different species utilize their strength and how our bodies are different. I started using these to track light trails. And these are long exposures taken around 2 a.m. At the time, I had just gotten a Garmin watch that let me see my paths that I was making on a day-to-day basis. And so I was interested in looking to see if these tracks that the beetles made, which these beetles primarily live in pairs, they live kind of on the same log, they eat them over time. I wanted to see if my paths were similar to theirs in any kind of way. So I started doing a long series of these. I didn't realize, though, that I had upset the ecosystem and made them by adding a light to them, bats would try and come in and take them out of my images. But again, the beetles started rubbing the backpacks off of their own bodies, so they became intelligent enough to kind of be done with my experiment, at which point I would stop the exposure. I started using these as ways. I started setting up infrared cameras to start tracking these so that I could try and redraw in 3 dimensions the beetles' tracks. This didn't go very far. Things at this time in terms of like 3D modeling and doing this kind of tracking just resulted in intestines, but I think it's worth showing. And I'm gonna wrap up here in just a second. I just wanna talk about what I'm working on now. So I'm currently an artist in residence at the LA Clean Tech Incubator, where I'm working on a project related to bark beetles in California wildfires. The bark beetle, there's been a lot of headlines, though they're very quiet, about how the bark beetle is a kind of silent collaborator in this issue of wildfires. They essentially eat the trees from the inside out, especially when we're in particular seasons of drought. Let's see if I can play this. So again, I've been interested in this, and this started, I'm trying to really locate myself within this landscape. I'm so used to operating and thinking about seasons. I'm obviously from the Midwest, and so this has been a very foreign transition for me the last 4 years. And so I started again in going on hikes, noticing that there were all of these pieces of bark with these really intricate paths that were eaten off of the bark. And so I've started utilizing those paths and again thinking about how these beetles are essentially carving up our trees and our forests, and how we do the same thing in making highways and road systems, and a lot of other kind of mark making that we do. So this project's relatively new, and I'm still working on a lot of ideas through it. I started by making this was for pedestrians in Long Beach. The city of Long Beach had asked me to take over this space where I was overlaying the LA highway system with bark beetle paths. And when you would walk through and look through different lenses, it would either erase one path or the other, kind of pointing to different similarities and how these kind of seemingly haphazard paths start looking a lot like our own systems where we've carved through the earth. The LA Arboretum's been kind enough to let me start coming and 3D scanning different specimens that they have. Like I said, I'm still trying to figure out what the final manifestation of this work is going to look like. But I've started 3D scanning pretty large objects that have bark beetle damage that are impacting both the LA Arboretum and the Huntington Library. They've also let me come and scan things there. These are some scale models. I'm working on, you can't see the trails up there very well, but I'm working on a series of sculptural pieces where the bark beetle paths are illuminated through an ultraviolet system. And this is just some kind of small versions of that. Again, I'm working on this on a large scale with a CNC machine and using that interface to ultimately carve out or recreate these paths on a human scale or a much larger scale. And that's what I'm working on right now. So soon I'll be doing 3D scans with a CT scanner at CSU San Bernardino, so I can look at these things from the inside out. Just some other things to kind of know. I was a SIGGRAPH art gallery chair, so I've spent a lot of time actually looking at robotics and robotics-based works. As mentioned, I went to Mexico for almost a month and a half to teach these kind of machining systems for 01 American Arts Incubator, which is a longtime art and tech institution in the Bay Area. And I've written extensively about, specifically about pests. I think of pests as kind of the first 3D printer. I mean, they're really, if we think about things like insects, termites, ants, leafcutter ants in particular, about these organisms, wasps that can build things with materials that they carry and source. I've written a lot about that in the 3D Atavist cookbook, as well as about tweet roach. I made that when I was 24. I had no idea how to talk about anything then. It took me a long time to write about it, and thinking about it in relationship to the movie, The Fifth Element. And if you guys remember, there's that cockroach that crawls across the table that has a spy camera, and they like smash it with a shoe. We've been kind of augmenting animals and these types of systems with our own technologies for a long time, and we continue to do so. And so a lot of my work is about kind of investigating that relationship of where technology and pest-based systems meet, and what that means for us kind of as a global whole. One thing I didn't show, I work on a lot of interactive robotic dog toys, so this last image doesn't make any sense, but these are my dogs, and thank you.